A humanitarian pause in Syria's eastern Ghouta has been broken by terrorists for a second day. That's according to the Syrian Reconciliation Centre. This is after safety corridors that were set up by Russia came under heavy shelling from militants. It prevented civilians from leaving the besieged district. The situation in the enclave was discussed at a UN Security Council meeting.
The Assad regime and their supporters have been pummeling eastern Ghouta, where 400,000 people live under siege and constant bombardment.
It needs to be understood that terrorists are still legitimate targets of military operations.
They are asking civilians to leave eastern Ghouta on the false premise that they can then attack anyone left in the area as much as they would like.
We set up temporary settlements for civilians. Ambulances are there.
Because we've been through this before, we know what Russia will say today.
No, you don't know.
They will say that there are terrorists in eastern Ghouta, so the Assad regime can bomb as ferociously and indiscriminately as it wants.
I want to ask you, what did you do to implement the resolution? Did you influence those who you consider moderate opposition? Did you persuade them to stop shelling and taking people hostage?
It was a heated meeting in the halls of the UN Security Council. We heard from different countries addressing the council regarding the situation in eastern Ghouta. Now, we've also heard Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, comment on the situation and point out that essentially this enclave in eastern Ghouta is being used to attack civilians in Damascus, and that civilians in eastern Ghouta are being used as human shield.
Unfortunately, there are lots of extremist forces in eastern Ghouta, as well as a range of terror organizations recognized by the UN. The shelling is continually coming from that area. On some days, the number of missile strikes and mortar shell attacks reaches 50 to 80. They even reach the territory of the Russian embassy. Should we tolerate this indefinitely? Of course not.
There have been a large number of efforts to protect civilians in the area. Russia carries out a 5-hour humanitarian pause on a daily basis in the hopes of protecting civilians and allowing them to get out through the humanitarian corridor. Furthermore, the UN Security Council has passed a resolution calling for a 30-day ceasefire. Now, a letter was sent to the UN Security Council by some of the opposition and rebel groups saying that they would honor this UN resolution. However, at this point, over 300 civilians have been prevented from leaving due to the attacks they've experienced as they try to escape. Now, the Russian representative pointed out that these kind of humanitarian concerns and outrage were not being raised while the liberation of Raqqa was taking place.
Where were you when US aircraft were levering Raqqa? Where was your outcry? It's been months since terrorists were forced out of the city, and it's still unfit for life.
The Security Council requests the Secretary General to expeditiously send a mission to Raqqa to assess humanitarian needs there.
There was quite clearly a gap in the international media in the way the different situations have been portrayed. When the Syrian city of Raqqa and the Iraqi city of Mosul were being liberated by the U.S.-led coalition, and a lot of bombing was taking place, we heard U.S. leaders making statements to the effect that civilian casualties are just a fact of life.
Civilian casualties are a fact of life.
In Iraq and in Syria, people are much more accepting that because it's their city being liberated. They understand what they were suffering.
Civilians will get caught in the crossfire, civilians will get hurt, civilians will get killed.
If you want to liberate your towns and cities, it comes at a price.
It's an unavoidable part of war, and commanders have to press on despite that. The responsibility for civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria lies with ISIS.
That is on them, not on us.
We are the good guys, and the innocent people on a battlefield know the difference.
A correspondent from RT Arabic is in eastern Ghouta for us. She has more now on the latest situation in the Syrian enclave.
It's the second day of the truce. We haven't seen any civilians walking through the corridor. It's known that there are many civilians who want to flee the enclave, to leave it through the one and only corridor open for civilians from Ghouta. However, militants prevent civilians from exiting and don't allow them to leave Ghouta through the evacuation route to reach the road to Damascus. The militant positions are just 300 or 400 meters from the corridor, near the camp of Al-Wafadin. The Syrian government has distributed leaflets among civilians of the militant-controlled enclave, with detailed information and a map on how to get into the area under government control. We can see that everything is ready here to receive civilians and to deal with any difficult humanitarian situation.
Earlier, we spoke to Professor of Political Sociology, Dr. Saeed Sadiq at the American University of Cairo. He believes it's the United States that's fueling tension in Syria by supplying various armed groups with weaponry.
So who is playing with fire? The one who is playing with fire is the one who is providing weapons, who is providing mercenaries, who is financing them, who is providing media coverage for them, and trying to show that what is happening in Ghouta is a masada, is a big massacre of innocent people. What they care about is those whom they had supplied arms, whom they had financed, whom they had been breeding in the last few years, and now they have lost the war, but they don't have the same courage to admit that they lost the war, to withdraw. They just keep on bargaining and making all those claims.